You turn a handle, and clean water appears. No thought, no planning, no risk. For roughly 300,000 years, every single ancestor you have ever had woke up with one problem that outranked food, outranked shelter, and outranked every predator on the landscape: finding water that would not kill them. You can survive about 3 weeks without food. You can survive about 3 days without water. That gap explains almost everything about how your ancestors organized their lives, where they walked, and when they moved. But here is the part nobody tells you. Finding water was rarely the hard part. Finding water that was safe was: think about what a water hole actually is. It is where everything drinks. Every antelope, every hyena, every sick animal, every dying one. It is the single most contaminated spot in the entire ecosystem, and it is also the only place you can drink. Your ancestors had to solve that contradiction over and over for thousands of generations without ever knowing that bacteria existed. So, what did they actually do? Some of the answers are so strange they sound invented. They are not. Start with the strangest one. Across the Kalahari and in Central Australia and along the dry margins of Africa, people learned to drink groundwater without digging a well at all. The technique is called a sip well. You find a low patch in a dry riverbed where the sand stays cool. You dig down an arm's length until the sand darkens and turns damp. You push a hollow reed or a stiff grass stem into that damp layer and pack sand tightly around it so nothing leaks in from above. Then you wait, and then you suck. Water seeps out of the sand grain by grain and climbs the straw into your mouth. It arrives already filtered. The sand has stripped out the mud, the algae, and most of the larger organisms that live in open water. You hold each mouthful in your cheeks and spit it into an empty ostrich eggshell to carry home. That is a water filtration system, built from a digging stick, a reed, and patience. Invented tens of thousands of years before anyone had any idea what was being filtered out. The anthropologist Richard Lee, who began living with the Juhwanzi of the Kalahari in 1963 and spent years recording exactly how they fed and watered themselves, described how completely a group's movement was governed by water. Not by game, not by weather, by which water holes were still holding, and how far apart they were. James Sussman, who has worked with the same communities for decades, describes the same logic. You do not live where the food is. You live where the water is, and you walk to the food. Now look again at that eggshell, because it is not a small detail. At Diepkloof Rock Shelter on the west coast of South Africa, the archaeologist Pierre-Jean Texier and his team recovered hundreds of fragments of ostrich eggshell, deliberately engraved with repeating hatched and cross-hatched patterns, dating to roughly 60,000 years ago. Not scratched at random, patterned, repeated across generations at the same site. A single ostrich egg holds about a liter. Punch a small hole in the top, empty it, engrave the outside, fill it with sip well water, plug the hole with grass, and bury it in the shade beside a bush you will recognize again. Researchers argue those engravings may have marked ownership or which group a container belonged to. Sit with what that means. Your ancestors were not just carrying water, they were caching it, burying full containers along routes they had not walked yet, and holding the location of every one of them in memory. A distributed water network, stored in a human head. Then there is the method that sounds like a joke, right up until you understand the biology. In Central Australia, when the surface water vanished entirely, people dug for frogs. The water-holding frog survives the dry season by absorbing as much water as its body can carry, burrowing down into the clay, and sealing itself inside a cocoon made from its own shed skin. There it waits, sometimes for years, until rain comes. Aboriginal groups learned to read the surface of a dry clay pan for the faint signs of a buried frog, dig it out, hold it, and press gently. The frog releases clear, clean, drinkable water. In many accounts, it was then placed back in the ground alive. Think about what that requires. You have to know that a particular animal exists underground in a place with no visible water. You have to know how to find it, how much pressure it can take, and that leaving it alive means it will still be there next season. That is not a desperate trick. That is a renewable, self-refilling walking canteen. And knowing about it is the difference between a landscape that kills you and a landscape that feeds you. What would you have to know about the ground under your feet to find water inside an animal? So, let us reconstruct a morning. You are in the Kalahari, roughly 12,000 years ago, though it could be 100,000 and almost nothing would change. You wake before the heat. Your group has camped a half-day's walk from the nearest standing water deliberately, because standing water at night is where the predators are. 2 of you carry a bundle of hollow reeds and a net bag of empty eggshells. You walk to a dry riverbed you have used before, and you read it. Which bend holds the damp? Which patch of sand stayed cool overnight? You dig. You feel the sand change temperature against your knuckles. You set the reed, pack it, and you begin, and it is slow. It takes a long time to fill one egg this way. You spit, you refill, you sink another reed a few meters away. By the time the sun is properly up, you have 8 full eggshells, and 6 of them will be buried, not carried, because the next stretch of walking has no water in it at all, and those 6 eggs are the only reason that route is survivable. Nobody in your group calls this technology. It is just what water is. Now, travel north into the Sahara, which has not always been a desert. Around 9,000 years ago, monsoon rains reached far further north than they do today and filled shallow basins in what is now the Egyptian Western Desert. At a site called Nabta Playa, the archaeologist Fred Wendorf and his team spent decades excavating something remarkable. Deep, walk-in wells, sloped shafts cut down through sediment to reach groundwater, some of them several meters deep, wide enough for a person to descend. They found the wells surrounded by evidence of a settlement that was organized, arranged, planned around them, and at the same site, one of the oldest known stone alignments in the world, a ring of upright stones set to track the sky. People were watching the heavens, at least in part, to know when the rains were coming back. Timekeeping and water were the same problem. At Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, the 11,000-year-old site of carved stone pillars that upended everything we thought we knew about early monuments, Klaus Schmidt and the researchers who followed him documented something easy to overlook beside those famous carvings. Basins cut into the bare limestone, with shallow channels carved to steer rainwater into them. Because there is no spring on that hilltop. None. Hundreds of people gathered there to haul and carve multi-ton pillars, and every drop of water they drank had to fall out of the sky and be caught before it ran away. And then there is heat. Before pottery, you cannot hang a container over a fire. So your ancestors did the opposite. They put the fire into the water. You heat stones in a fire until they are searing. You lift them with green wooden tongs and drop them into a skin bag, or a pit lined with hide filled with water. The water erupts, then boils. Archaeologists find the residue of this everywhere, in enormous quantities, and it has a name. Fire-cracked rock. Stones shattered by being heated and quenched again and again. We cannot know what they intended. They may only have been cooking, but boiling water kills nearly everything living in it, which means your ancestors were sterilizing their water thousands of years before anyone could have explained why it worked. Here's the twist you probably did not expect. You would assume all of this got better as humans got more sophisticated. Villages, farming, cities, it got dramatically worse. Frank Marlowe, who spent years with the Hadza of Tanzania and published his account of their lives in 2010, described people drinking from water holes that were frequently muddy and shared with animals. But the Hadza move, a camp of 30 people that relocates every few weeks, never stays long enough to poison its own water. A village of 500 people that never moves does exactly that. Human waste and animal waste accumulate around a fixed well, used by the same families for generations. Then add irrigation. Slow, shallow, sun-warmed canals standing still all season, which is close to a perfect breeding habitat for snails, mosquitoes, and parasites. Rosalie David and the Manchester Mummy Research Team found the evidence written into ancient Egyptian bodies. Schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease whose larvae develop inside freshwater snails and burrow directly through the skin of anyone standing in the water. Farmers stood in those canals every single day of their working lives. Agriculture did not clean up the water. It gathered more people around less of it and held them there permanently. That problem lasted almost until now. The single largest jump in human life expectancy did not come from surgery or antibiotics or genetics. It came from sand filtration and chlorination, and from the boring civic decision to keep drinking water and sewage apart. That happened in most of the world within the last 120 years.